Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever we happen to find you. Thank you for joining us, and let me welcome you on behalf of all of us at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress for what is going to be a fantastic discussion today on the future of war, the changing nature of war, and I can't think of anyone else better to be joining us than Shashank Joshi, the Economist defense editor, a great, obviously one of the great publications, but also fantastic coverage we've read of the war in Ukraine, the impact of technology on warfare, and we're seeing it too in this work we're doing at CSPC on aligning for strategic competition, the questions about the lessons we're learning from the war in Ukraine, how technology and technological achievements will be applied to the battlefield, how China is modernizing and advancing their forces, and what are we understanding too about this intersection, perhaps now, of economic power, technological innovation, those sinews of military might that we don't quite count alongside tanks, guns, and planes, but that policymakers see as increasingly important. We're going to get all into that with a great discussion. I turn it over to my colleague Joshua, and we'll also have opportunities for you for Q&A, but I can't think of a more timely topic, but one that can look forward and give us some important things to think about. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you, Mr. Joshi, for joining us today. As Dan said, I'm a very big fan of The Economist and your writing and research, which has been incredibly timely and in many ways very prescient for what we're seeing today on the battlefield in Ukraine in the fight with Russia. I do want to get to all that, but we've seen in the last 24 hours probably the culmination of several months of political turmoil in British politics and the announcement of the resignation of Prime Minister Johnson as leader of the Conservative Party, but also taking pathway to potentially leaving as Prime Minister full stop come this fall. Without getting a lot into the nuance and the politics behind it, I'm curious what your take is on the current environment, how that may affect the United Kingdom's defense policy writ large, but also how it might affect, if at all, the support to Ukraine.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the kind words, Joshua. Please do call me Shashank. Thank you very much for having me. It's very kind of you, and I'm really looking forward to this chat. You're right. It's been a 24 hours of surreal chaos here in the UK. I've been watching it all very closely. What are the defense implications of all of this? First of all, like any government in turmoil, you have limited bandwidth to do foreign policy and defense policy. And so let me give you a couple of examples of that. The Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, was in Bali. In fact, her plane was parked next to Secretary Blinken's plane for the G20 summit. She is now heading back in order to begin her campaign to succeed Boris Johnson, because she is one of the contenders. So we immediately have a situation where the Foreign Secretary is abandoning the G20 summit in order to campaign for political succession, which is not ideal from the perspective of a cool, calm, continuous foreign policy. Another example would be the Indian Defense Minister a few days ago cancelled his trip to the UK. We can only guess why, but I think inability to have all the meetings he would need to have is another reason. So bandwidth is being narrowed. The second thing is, Boris Johnson is now an interim prime minister. The nature of our system is that the transition takes a little bit of time because the prime minister is the leader of the largest party in the House of Commons, or the party that can sustain a majority. That's the leader of the Tory party. A succession race has now formally begun, so he is on his way out, but he will be in office for at least the next month. He is not supposed to make big calls or bind his successors in different ways during that period. So long-term decisions, which of course may include things like funding for Ukraine, funding for the Ukrainian army, big sensitive defense decisions like procurement decisions, which have cast long shadows on policy, these may all be affected. The final point is, who is going to succeed him? On the whole, most plausible successors are pretty hawkish on Ukraine, on Russia and Ukraine, right? So I can point you to Liz Truss, the foreign secretary, who has repeatedly talked about the need to evict Russia from all of the territory controlled by it since February, indeed talking about evicting Russia from Crimea. We have a sort of Defense Secretary Ben Wallace, who is in the most recent polls I've seen today, looking like the front runner, a very unassuming character who's played a very, very significant role in supporting Ukraine and is widely respected on really both sides of the aisle in this country. But I will say that there are a few sort of more interesting cases. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, I should say the ex-Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, who of course resigned resigned yesterday, but was in political trouble because of his tax status and his former green card in the United States. He, like many people who run finance ministries, has taken a slightly different approach to these questions, not just on Russia, but also on China, a much less hawkish approach, an approach that is essentially more mercantilist, more worried about trade and investment, an approach that perhaps believes that Russia may be more likely to prevail in this conflict in some fashion, and therefore is more hesitant about talking in terms of victory or defeating Russia. And so a Rishi Sunak victory, I think, it wouldn't necessarily be a drastic reset, but I would begin to ask some questions about the degree of hawkishness we see on Russia policy, on Ukraine policy, even on China policy under a Sunak-led administration. But having said that, the center of gravity of UK politics within the party and indeed across both parties has shifted considerably. And many of the people who would be in line, not necessarily for the premiership, but for big jobs like Foreign Secretary or Defense Secretary, people like Tom Tugendhat, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, who has never held any ministerial position, they are really quite strong, robust voices on countering Russia, countering China. And so I think we'd expect to see, on balance, a degree of continuity.
It's interesting that you bring that up because the Secretary of Defense, Ben Wallace, has been very vocal. He penned an essay, I'd probably say, prior to the opening of the war, and I'm getting the times wrong on this one, that was very sharp on defending Ukraine and the need to resist Russia. The United Kingdom was very forward-leaning from the outset in terms of providing aid and material to Ukraine, has been sending a lot of support. The Ministry of Defense's strategic intelligence advisories have been fantastic. I'm curious what your thoughts are, what is behind all of that? Not just the security and stability of Europe, but is this part of a post-Brexit United Kingdom trying to reassert itself in European security? And do you see this as following out from the integrated review, which also happened last year?
I think that's right, Joshua. I think to some degree we should say that the UK's strong support for Ukraine predated some of this. It began in the David Cameron years. It predated Brexit. You look at something like Operation Orbital, which was our training program for Ukraine, alongside the Canadians, the Americans, and others. This was established before many of those factors became a serious political force in the UK. So we've always kind of had an eye on Ukraine and have taken a more hawkish position on it. And our Russia policy, I would say, overall, has also hardened considerably over the years, beginning with the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko with polonium-210, continuing to the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal in Salisbury in 2018 with Novichok, a nerve agent, and then following through to the mass expulsion. We saw many mass expulsion of Russian spies just now, but let me tell you, we expelled what we believe to be every single Russian undeclared intelligence officer in the UK in 2018. So we had no one left to expel. So that sort of strong stance on Russia has predated many of these factors. However, you're absolutely correct to say that this desire to kind of find an independent voice in Europe, to reach out to allies independently of the European Union, including not just through bilateral ties to Ukraine, but also, for example, a trilateral partnership between Poland, the UK, and Ukraine signed in February, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a 10-nation military bloc that is a more flexible group that could act in the days or weeks before NATO has a consensus to activate Article 5. These are all things we have seen step up, even the unilateral guarantees we gave to Finland and Sweden last month. So all of that, I think, is part of an effort to be more agile, to be more kind of nimble, in order perhaps to justify the sense that we are out of the European Union. We are no longer bound by this common foreign policy. We should take advantage of that. Now, some of that is deeply over-egged, and I myself believe that many of these steps could have been taken while we remained inside the European Union. So I'm not going to sort of endorse the idea that somehow Brexit was necessary to this, but it is, I believe, as you say, connected.
One of the interesting things that flows out from that is it seems to be the bulk of the spending within the United Kingdom on defense seems to have gone to, correct me if I'm wrong, the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force as of late. The British Army seems to have gotten the short end of the stick, aside from a few organizational changes. I mean, the establishment of the Rangers, even Prime Minister Johnson last year on the release of the integrated review said the days of big tank battles are over. I'm curious now, if you see that sort of attitude changing, if you're going to see, alongside that 2.5% increase in GDP spending for defense that the Prime Minister articulated, a shift back towards reinvestment in the British Army, which has been steadily declining over the years.
It's very interesting because the defense command paper, as we called it last spring, did put a lot of resources into the army, but they were over the next 10 years. In other words, what you could talk about is that the modernization cycles of the three services are out of sync. The Navy has invested in these 2 aircraft carriers, which are the flagships. The Air Force has been investing in a new fleet of F-35, and also the 6th generation Tempest program. A lot of money's gone into that and is beginning to flow into that. But the Army modernization has been sort of forward loaded. And in addition to that, it has come at the expense of numbers. So the army is the smallest it has been since the Napoleonic period. And this has, I'm afraid to say, fundamentally kneecapped our capability. Our ability to deliver commitments to NATO of a full armored division is in considerable doubt. And everyone you talk to in the army will acknowledge this. We're in a bad place. We are undoubtedly in a bad place. And what you are seeing, I think, is not necessarily a rebalancing between the Navy and the army towards the army, because of course the new Chief of Defense Staff who took charge about a month ago is a admiral. He was a former First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin. And if you'll indulge me a small plug, we have him on our podcast, The Economist Asks, this week, which should be out today or tomorrow if you want to hear his views on these issues. But what we have seen is, I think, the army rethink its own priorities, because what happened in the last year is they said, what are we for? Are we here to defend Europe, or are we here to train up other allies like a sort of souped up ranger force? Are we here to kind of project influence in the Asia Pacific region in small detachments? Are we kind of an adjunct to the Navy, like a sort of Marine Corps plus? What are we here to do? What's our identity? What you saw last week at the RUSI think tank was a speech by the Chief of the General Staff, the head of the army, General Sir Patrick Sanders, basically say, forget all of that stuff. You are here for one reason, and it is to prepare for a land war in Europe against Russia. Now, that may seem kind of obvious to everyone here, but it wasn't obvious to the army. And that strategic direction is now going down. And I think you're going to need to see a sort of serious reprioritization of resources, because it will shape what you need to buy. If your aim is to focus on Russia, in Eastern Europe, in the Baltics, the stuff you're going to buy is going to be quite different to what you would be buying if your focus was on kind of gray zone posturing, peacetime contingency, sort of sub-threshold deterrence, all of these other things. We are seeing an army that is becoming more focused on this core European task.
And in light of that, do you see the UK's acquisition system, which has had a number of shortfalls and scandals in recent years, being up to the task both of equipping and arming an army that is refocusing for a land war in Europe, but also sustaining the fight and forward deployment of munitions to Ukraine, but also to the NATO partners?
You know, the jury is out. The jury is absolutely out. There's a number of enormous issues. Equipment's at the heart of them, right? Without getting too technical for everyone here, because we don't, I know there's a different levels of appetite in getting into military kit, but we've cancelled our program for warrior infantry fighting vehicles, IFVs, which is largely on financial grounds, but it's left this huge hole in the way the British Army is supposed to fight. It doesn't have a kind of viable IFV at the heart of its infantry force. The Ajax program, Ajax was supposed to be our kind of armored reconnaissance vehicle and also kind of a digital backbone, a kind of hub. You might call it the F-35 for land, right? Able to take signals from other platforms, pass them back, sort of fuse data from an infantry squadron, from special forces, from planes, from other sensors, and act as a kind of digital data hub. This program has been hugely mismanaged. It turns out that the platform, it vibrates so much that it deafens the people inside it, and that the army did not tell ministers this until it was too late. So we wasted enormous amounts of money. In fact, there was sort of rumors that we might send Ajax to Ukraine a few months ago. It didn't come to anything, but there was a joke that, are we going to send these to the Ukrainians or the Russians to deafen them? And that sense is that the army has utterly bungled procurement. Munitions, we're in pretty bad shape on munitions, right? Some of the stuff I heard at the RUSI Land Warfare Conference last week was that and we wrote about in the cover story you mentioned on our long war, was at current rates of Russian consumption of artillery, our stockpiles would last for 2 days. At Ukrainian rates of consumption, they would last for 2 weeks. Okay, still not great. We've given away a bunch of stuff to the Ukrainians. Fantastic. I'm delighted that we've done that. But, particularly in things like NLAWs, the anti-tank missiles, we have severely eaten into our own stockpiles. And we now face very difficult decisions. Do we replace like for like? Or do we replace with a next generation replacement, which will cost more money and which will take a long time? We're leaving a capability gap. And how the hell do you persuade the finance ministry of this, particularly at a time when a treasury minister, maybe a chancellor of the exchequer, may be taking over Downing Street? So this is not unique to us. Many European countries face this problem, but the British Army faces it particularly acutely. That's just a tiny slice of problems. We could go on, and there's a number of other decisions to do with how we calibrate our new commitments we have made at the NATO summit to the Estonians, how much we put a brigade into Eastern Europe, how much we forward deploy heavy armor in Germany, in Senelager, how much we put into Poland. All of these questions, are going to sort of hang over the force. This is crunch time. And I think, there's one line I'll leave you with, Joshua, is to say, in that speech I mentioned, the Chief of the General Staff said, this is a 1937 moment. Now, as many people pointed out, if it is a 1937 moment, that implies you have 2 years to get your stuff in order. You don't anymore have 5, 6, 7 years to say, we'll experiment, we'll war game, we'll prototype, we'll consider this or that, we'll run a 2-year tender and then build up a production line. There is a sense arriving here, and the way that I sense, has been descending on your defense community there for longer than it has here, that time is becoming of the essence, and we don't have a 10-year window to rearm anymore.
It's very interesting that you bring that up, because what we've seen in recent weeks is the controversy over the United States Marine Corps' Force Design 2030, 2035, and the furor that has created within the community that is trying to pivot towards a defined new environmental threat, getting rid of the tanks, pivoting towards small light reconnaissance units, as you said, the digital backbone, having Marine Force units be that. And it's very interesting to see how that's going to play out on this side of the pond. Do you envision potentially a similar debate as the Army sort of reasserts itself as a land warfare component specifically, or is there generally consensus as that is the case and that's the direction things need to go in?
Yeah, first of all, I mean, I should say, I think the Marine Corps decisions have been, watching from a distance, from an external view, have been impressive and admirable, and actually, I'm impressed by them. But the Marine Corps is the Marine Corps, and although it is larger than the British Army is as an institution, it does also, you also have the US Army on the side. And whereas in European armies, in common with all other middle powers, whether that's us, the French, the Australians, all manner of others, we don't have that margin of safety with our military forces to take those bets. There's no hedge, there's no safety net. If you get it wrong, there's no other force to rely on that has all the heavy armor and waiting that can be deployed, that can be reconstituted and rebuilt, that has the reserves. I think there is a consensus. This is now a force on land warfare. However, I will say that, to go back to the point, the Chief of Defense Staff is a Navy man. He was appointed for many reasons. He played a prominent role in the AUKUS partnership in initiating that process. His priorities are sort of still global Britain and making sure there is an Indo-Pacific tilt. A tilt, not a kind of huge pivot, but a tilt to make sure we have a kind of presence in Indo-Pacific that is explicitly linked not to defense priorities alone, but to what we call the prosperity agenda. In other words, making sure we have a sound defense relationship with India, with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, in order to support our trade, investment, technology, and diplomatic priorities as well. So defense diplomacy has become very important in the UK. And so there is always going to be this tension between an army that says, right, we have to focus everything we have on countering a Russian conventional war in Europe, and a military force that is being told by ministers, you have to think about how you are going to use your military assets to build goodwill in Delhi, in Canberra, in Seoul, in Tokyo. These are not things you can easily combine. And I will say the other point is, there is still a sense that we can't just have a kind of British Army of the Rhine where you sit in fixed garrisons and wait for the balloon to go up. Ministers, politicians want to see the armed forces competing in peacetime. So, for example, we just sent advisors from the army to Bosnia to contest Russian influence operations. I think that's good. That shows you what kind of this era of constant competition. You don't just wait for a war to begin, then you send in the army. You use your military assets in the same way, of course, that we have seen Cybercom forward deploy assets into Eastern Europe to contest Russian cyber operations. This is the nature of modern sort of persistent engagement, as the US DoD has called it for recent years. But it puts you in tension, I think, with a military force that is either designed for high-end, exquisite peer-to-peer warfighting, or one that also has to be capable of all these other tasks. I think we're still kind of figuring this out.
I want to come back to that Indo-Pacific tilt, but looking specifically at Ukraine and where we stand today, we've seen that the United Kingdom did a fantastic job, very forward-leaning, very early on, in providing a number of arms and munitions in the immediate aftermath of February 24th. We seem to be reaching a point now, which your leader piece in this week's Economist talks about shifting for that long war. Yeah. And the very different conditions that are present now for that long war fight versus that sort of short, high intensity fight. I'm curious if you can elaborate on how you see that transition happening, what is needed to happen, and where we should be looking, or things about which we should be concerned for that long fight.
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, I should say, I think many of the most important factors in this are not military, and therefore, to some degree, outside of my wheelhouse. But I accept they're incredibly important, right? Ukraine could prevail on the battlefield, in spectacular ways, but if its major port remains under blockade, if its grain cannot get out, if its economy can't leave, if its exports can't resuscitate, if constant sporadic Russian standoff missile strikes on civilian and industrial and critical targets continue, like railheads, rail nodes, grain silos, all of these things, prevent reinvestment in Ukraine, it will lose. It will lose in the long term. And therefore, there are non-military factors that sort of underlie lots of this, including political ones. But from a military perspective, I would sort of say there's a few things. One of them is just sort of raw sustenance of this war, right? So that includes manpower and it includes munitions. On the manpower front, Ukraine has a large pool of enthusiastic recruits, even though many of them have been thrown into battle in Severodonetsk and other theaters and have suffered gravely because they were not prepared, they were not well armed, they were not prepared for this kind of fight. But they still have a pool of people, but they need to train them. And that mass training is going to be very difficult because, how do you pull enough people out of the fight to then allocate to that training without diluting your frontline forces? The Russians, as we know, are putting some of their reserve officers and their residual officers into reserve battalions and committing them, which means you don't have people who can then train the next generation of conscripts and of soldiers. So that's you're cannibalizing the force, and that's a problem for Ukraine as well. Munitions is a huge challenge because of the reason I already mentioned. The rates of consumption are enormous. Ukraine has basically run out of some types of 152 millimeter Soviet caliber ammunition, run out of some types of forces like Tochka tactical ballistic missiles. And Europeans are clean out of these forces. I spoke to an Estonian official about a month ago who said it doesn't exist. We're out of this kind of ammunition. It's just not there. We don't have any of it left, beyond perhaps core stockpiles you need to sustain your own forces if you're, Poland or Bulgaria, and you need to make sure you can use your own weapons. So this transition to a NATO standard force is still a long way from fruition, right? And you have a couple of issues. You have, first of all, you have a huge array of artillery systems now. For example, you have M777s, you have French Caesars, you have British light artillery, which the Australians are helping to train on, and sorry, the Kiwis, I think. You have HIMARS, you have MLRS, and I think different types of MLRS, multiple launch rocket systems, which are like HIMARS, but slightly different British and German systems. You have the Panzerhaubitze 2000, the German systems. Now, this is crazy. How can you imagine having sort of a fleet of vehicles made up of 10 different types of cars, very different cars from completely different countries and production chains, which need different parts, different maintenance, different supply chains. This is a huge logistical challenge, and it's a huge replenishment challenge for NATO allies, first of all. And it's a training challenge, because it is much easier to train Ukrainians how to use guns. They're pretty good at this, right? They know how to do it. Than it is to teach them how to maintain and fix them. So at some point we have to ask, can we make this more efficient? If we're going to be able to support Ukraine in a campaign that lasts for more than a year, we have to think about making our support maximally efficient. And the last thing I'll say on this is, before I ramble too much, is just on the tactics. It is vital that we make sure Ukraine uses these new weapons in the most effective way possible. And that's a debate that's now unfolding, because we cannot match the Russians gun for gun. It's not going to happen. Even if we could physically do it, politically we can't do it. We would denude every European army of our artillery, and at a time when we are recapitalizing furiously for the reasons I've just outlined in our UK-focused discussion. So, what has been pointed out to me is that the weapons Ukraine is getting, particularly, sort of HIMARS type thing, MLRS, these were conceived in the Cold War during the time of doctrines like, air-land battle and other philosophies, precisely for this kind of adversary, to go up against a big, numerically superior Soviet-type force that is pounding you with artillery. And the philosophy was, you don't go after them gun for gun, you outrange them, and you hit their critical nodes, ammunition depots, supply hubs, command posts, systematically behind enemy lines until you paralyze them as a force. So it's not that you kill all their soldiers or you kind of grind them to a halt. It's you paralyze the brains and the muscles behind the front lines. Ukraine is beginning to do that, but the jury is still out on whether it's going to be able to sustain that. And part of the issue is Western governments don't fully understand Ukraine's military strategy. They don't understand what it wants to do. It doesn't have the capacity to mount a counteroffensive across a 1,000-kilometer front to take back Donbass, Donetsk, to take back Kherson, Zaporizhia, all of the places it lost. It has to choose. It has to prioritize. And Western officials are trying to figure out, what are you trying to do? Because then we can train you optimally. We can help you. We can guide you. We can help you target these things. That process is underway now.
I'm curious, looking specifically at the battlefield to build off of that, because we've seen a lot of innovations and the things that have been discussed for a very long time about the role of drones, the role of unmanned aerial vehicles, loitering munitions. I wanted to get your sense of how the battlefield has fundamentally changed, because prior to the war, when you first came to The Economist, you penned a fantastic series of essays in the Defense Technology Quarterly, looking at the transparent battlefield. I'm curious, looking back at that versus where we are today, what you find most striking and what has confirmed what you expected and also what you didn't expect to see, but you are now seeing.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I'm still wrestling with it, really. I'm kind of constantly wrestling with it. I think first of all we've sort of swung perhaps simplistically in the early days of the conflict. There was a view that, wow, this is all about asymmetric weapons and tactics. Javelins, NLAWs, TB2, Bayraktar TB2 drones. This kind of validates this idea that small, mobile, light infantry armed with asymmetric instruments can completely paralyze a bigger force, which in many ways was, the kind of mood of the British Defence Review last year, right? That was a sort of bet. What we then saw was the kind of swing to, oh no, it's all about legacy weapons, what we in the UK called sunset capabilities. Heavy artillery has been vitally important. Heavy artillery was important even in the first days of the conflict, right? Because the Ukrainians used it to good effect. The Russians couldn't get it to the front lines. It was jammed up behind their convoys. The Ukrainians outranged the Russians and they could target their artillery more effectively. And the line was, oh, it's actually all about artillery. It's about artillery. It's about tanks. It's about heavy armor. It's about MBTs. And I think the truth is that it's context dependent. It depends on the geography. It depends on the nature of the battle. It depends on the offense or the defense. And the really important thing is it is all about how you use these, which is such a boring lesson, but it's a kind of important one, right? The way we have seen the Russians employ heavy armor is so poor, is so deficient in tactical aptitude that it makes it difficult to draw out lessons for these things. Because if we had seen, let's say we had Israeli tank crews manning these Russian T-72s and Russian Soviet-era tanks in the first days of the war, would we have seen javelins be as successful? Or would we have seen combined arms tactics designed to suppress anti-tank squads with dismounted infantry, with concentrated artillery fire, with mortars, with smoke screens, with deception? Would that have neutralized some of these things? So that's lesson one, right? Which is these enduring principles of warfare about combined arms, using weapons, using different weapons in harmony so that each compensates for the weaknesses of the other. That is still critical. That's kind of one piece. The other piece I would say is that we are not seeing the full picture of how these weapons are being used. So it's not about necessarily whether you use a TB2 drone to go and strike a Russian command post, or whether you use a old kind of Soviet era artillery piece to bombard the headquarters, as indeed the Ukrainians did in for example in Kherson airport, killing Russian generals in the first month of the war. What data, what intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance enabled that strike? And on that front, I can't prove it, but I strongly suspect that both Western intelligence, direct intelligence, and Western enabled tech companies, so for example, companies that facilitate data fusion, pulling in data from commercial satellite imagery, from electronic intelligence, radio frequency satellites, from electronic warfare stations and transmitters, receivers, from infantry reconnaissance platoons on the ground, from all of these sources, and that process it using modern machine learning methodologies, have facilitated Ukraine's use of these weapons, whichever weapons they are, whether modern or old. And we haven't fully seen that yet. So therefore, what I'm saying is you can claim vindication whether you are a kind of believer in modern asymmetric kinetic weapons, whether you're a believer that AI will transform warfare, or whether you're a kind of traditionalist who thinks that artillery and heavy armor are still the king of the battlefield. All of these factions can claim a degree of vindication, and I think justly so. We kind of have to remember that you can't slice away one of these things and expect the whole thing to work with sort of full effect. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it definitely does. So Michael Kaufman, he joined us last week to talk very much about this and was saying that he's a bit more, I think, reserved on the analytical side, but saying that it's too early to learn the lessons because we don't quite fully see the full picture, and the lessons that we thought we had learned very early on are not necessarily the lessons that we're going to find today. And I think you're spot on about this almost being a mirror for kind of whatever you want to see it in. It's a vindication for those who say drones and loitering munitions are going to be fantastic. It's a vindication for those who say, you know, tanks still matter, and potentially arguably for those who also say tanks don't matter anymore. I wanted to pivot a little bit to building off of the increased armament that we're seeing going to the battlefield. You had mentioned the HIMARS, you had mentioned the MLRS, systems with increasing range to do the aspects of deep battle, to targeting those Russian-specific nodes of operation. We've seen increased bellicosity and language out of Moscow about the potential for escalation. And I'm turning specifically towards your piece on the nuclear taboo. You recently wrote, the mixture of norms, treaties, mutual assurances, blandishments, suasion, technical mechanisms, fear, and taboo, which kept the world from seeing nuclear weapons used against armies or cities since 1945, was looking pretty ragged before Putin's invasion. I'm curious what your sense is specifically to Ukraine, because there are a lot of folks who their analysis says that this is just Russians being Russian, but also how that fits within a broader context of the erosion of the nuclear taboo and where we stand today when it comes to nuclear weapons.
Before I answer that, can I add one coda to my last answer, which I just remembered?
Please.
I want to commend a very good report published by Jack Watling and Nick Reynolds of RUSI last week, based on recent fieldwork in Ukraine. And it pointed out that when a Russian artillery team had use of UAV reconnaissance available to them, they could strike a target in 3 minutes. When they only had other methods like electronic warfare direction finding or something similar to counter battery radar, 30 minutes. That's a huge difference. And it shows you if you can get the UAV up, it still makes an enormous difference. But that's a big if, because as we have also seen in Donbass, the Ukrainian TB2s have effectively been down. What they're doing is sending up a UAV. It's immediately being hit by electronic warfare. If it isn't, then they know they can carve a path out through with aviation. But this shows you the sort of conclusion I'm pulling out of this, Joshua, is that if you have a UAV to do that, you can transform your targeting capability. But your ability to use it is still constrained by old-fashioned capabilities that were operational in the 1950s, if not before. Good old-fashioned jamming with radio waves. So the question of technological dominance will always depend on context and the specifics. So sorry, with that out of the way, just to kind of get that little nugget across.
Well, I would like to jump on that. It's interesting you
please,
mention that, because some of the lessons that came out of Afghanistan was we had seen the ability of drones, the Predator, the Reaper drone, the AC-130, and folks talking about how this was going to be a revolution in the way that wars were fought. And the asterisk with that was, provided you have a permissive operating environment and control the airspace. And it seems to fit very much with that RUSI study you were citing, is that it's all well and good if you have it and can operate it, but if you don't, it's just a very expensive piece of equipment sitting on the ground.
Yes, yes. Now, of course, it's not to say you can't restore that advantage. You can't restore the permissiveness of your airspace if you, for example, were able to conduct deep strikes on the Russian air defense systems that were preventing your or EW systems preventing your drones from getting up in the air. But it shows you this idea that warfare is kind of in a continuous interplay of all of these simultaneously competing capabilities, and you change one element and the whole system kind of goes out of whack, right? So if you could suppress the EW for long enough to get your UAV up, you could do serious damage. But it all depends on, sort of your suite of capabilities to do that. So with that in mind, back to your nuclear question, I think what we have seen in Ukraine, we've seen a lot of wars in which nuclear powers have gone to war against non-nuclear countries. The Falklands, the US many times, China, Vietnam, countless times. We have even seen examples where nuclear powers have made implicit or explicit threats of nuclear use. Indeed, I would personally argue that we saw hints of this in Vietnam from the US, and I would argue that we saw, the first Bush administration entertain this idea in the first Gulf War, where there was ambivalence or ambiguity about US policy. We know that, of course, George H.W. Bush had internally committed not to use nuclear weapons, even in response to US Iraqi biological weapons, but that was not the public signal that was sent. What we see in Ukraine is a state using nuclear weapons to as a shield, not just to conduct its conventional aggression against Ukraine, a war of conquest, not just a kind of small peripheral campaign like the Falklands or the Kargil campaign with India and Pakistan, but a much bigger war of conquest, but also as a shield to prevent third-party intervention in that conflict, which is why the Taiwan comparison is so important. The comparison in terms of the kind of mechanics of each case, and the comparison in terms of the lessons that China takes away from this about its ability to forestall US intervention in a cross-strait campaign, because that is ultimately the kind of same, the grammar of those conflicts would be the same in terms of the way China would be able to use the threat of nuclear escalation, the perceived imbalance in resolve, China believing it cares more about Taiwan than the US cares about Taiwan, in the same way that Russia believes it cares more about Ukraine than the US cares about Ukraine. So that to me is new. But in terms of the taboo, the kind of way we talk about nuclear weapons, it is a slow grinding process of erosion that I would say goes back some way. It has its roots in a generation of people who have not grown up with the same, Cold War threat, as we saw, even particularly in the 1980s, a sort of a generation of leaders. For example, I look at the politicians who, to give an example, who are racing to succeed Boris Johnson. A good number of them, are sort of they're a little bit older than me, but not some of them not hugely so. And they grew up in their formative years were the 90s. A kind of non-nuclear decade in which nuclear risk was something that happened in South Asia, not here, in which we didn't think about nuclear war fighting. We didn't have to think about questions like the ones the US is debating over a sea-launched nuclear cruise missile, SLICMs, and the kind of question about, do we need low-yield capabilities in sub-strategic or non-strategic use? But having said that, I think this also connects to the glib way that some leaders have spoken about nuclear weapons in the last several years. And I include in this President Donald Trump. I include in this some of the people around him. I include Narendra Modi in India, and many other people. This is not a kind of, I'm not singling out particular leaders here. I think the way we talk about nuclear weapons has become more casual and sort of less mindful of the gravitas and consequence of these weapons.
I'm glad you brought up the Taiwan comparison, because it's something that I think has been getting traction here in the United States, and it's been interesting to watch that. You mentioned some of the lessons and the comparison in terms of the language that are being used when we look at Ukraine and look at Taiwan. What sort of lessons do you envision Beijing is taking from this conflict in terms of military lessons? And equally, what do you think that Taiwan should take away from this conflict? And are the comparisons apt, or is it a bit overdone?
I think there are legitimate comparisons, and I think it's the kind of power of those comparisons that probably prompted President Biden to issue his, as we saw a month ago, his third set of remarks on Taiwan, clarifying that the US would come to Taiwan's aid. Clarifications that were, of course, we saw walked back by the White House, but nevertheless represented a contradiction with existing US policy of strategic ambiguity over the likelihood of US response. I think that was done because there were genuine concerns by the president about what lessons China might be taking and the sense of distraction. I think that there are a number of other issues that also are relevant, because resupplying Taiwan is not easy for obvious reasons. It's an island, and it's an island that's not next to NATO territory, or kind of has a sort of easy kind of access. If you look at Ukraine, we've got Bulgaria, Poland, Romania. You've got sort of a huge country with strategic depth and supply lines, and an adversary that is proving to be pretty incapable of dynamic targeting, of hitting moving targets and convoys to interdict those things. This is a whole different ballgame if you're resupplying Taiwan. And in a war over Taiwan, there are strong incentives, military incentives, to strike the other side first, to blind them and to deny them the use of capabilities like air defense, satellite intelligence, and so on and so forth. And now, in the Ukraine case, we have been able to keep Ukraine in this fight for 4 months using purely indirect support. That may not prove as easy with Taiwan. And the US will be forced into some incredibly difficult decisions about whether or not it strikes targets on mainland China and thereby increases the risk of reciprocal strikes on US bases in Asia or the US mainland. And those risks would be manipulated ruthlessly by the PRC to try and precisely influence that decision making. And so I think that it puts the US in a really difficult position that it can only compensate for in some ways by either pre-positioning equipment on Taiwan or deepening defense ties now, which comes with substantial diplomatic and political costs, or by signaling that the political stakes the US sees on the island are so big and so much bigger than those in Taiwan that China should make no mistake that the US is willing to run that risk of nuclear escalation. That's not an easy sell because talk is cheap. Leaders know this. But you know, this is a debate that we see playing out among Asian allies who are now obviously having their own debates about what they might need to do in a Taiwan contingency, even if the US were not present and not willing to act.
It's interesting you brought up AUKUS beforehand and seeing that as part of that deepening at a very sort of operational level of the relationship between the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States. And it remains to be seen how that is actually operationalized. What do you see as the sort of follow-on elements of AUKUS? And I want to tie in the point that you had made earlier on in our conversation about the tilt of the United Kingdom towards the Indo-Pacific. I think Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin made a very candidly ham-fisted remark saying it'd be more helpful if the United Kingdom stayed in its own sort of backyard. But as you mentioned, there is an inextricable history, but also a number of interests that are parallel to the United States' and liberal democracies writ large in the Indo-Pacific. I'm curious what you see is how that relationship plays out, particularly as we find ourselves confronting a very aggressive and rising China.
I think that what we see unfolding in Europe is going to be a paradox. On the one hand, in cementing, okay, how do I put this? In kind of clarifying the Russia-China alignment that is taking place, particularly in the February 4th joint vision statement, it has made it easier. It's a lubricated transatlantic cooperation on China. And I think evidence of that is to be found. Yesterday, I was in the headquarters of MI5, our domestic intelligence service, watching a speech by the MI5 Director General sitting next to Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, issuing words that I never thought would come out of the words of a mouth of a British official on China, talking about a game-changing strategic contest over decades. I can't begin to tell you what a change this is in kind of the way we talk about China in the UK. And in the NATO summit, in the strategic concept, we saw all 30 allies, including countries like Greece or Hungary, who we may have seen in the kind of sympathetic to China camp 5 years ago, saying Russia and China are in a strategic alliance, and they represent an authoritarian pushback to the rules-based order. The mood on China has hardened, and that war has accelerated this. It's accelerated that process. However, on the other hand, on the other side of the ledger, it's going to be Europe first for a while. We don't have the bandwidth to cope with doing an awful lot in the Indo-Pacific. We're going to keep it up for the reasons I talked to you about at the beginning. The French may or may not keep it up. I think probably will, but they were burnt so badly by AUKUS. You had people questioning whether this really meant they need to reevaluate their entire Indo-Pacific posture or how they do it. So on the military front, we're going to be doing less and less in Asia. Our bandwidth to do it will be limited. I'm not saying, carrier strike groups are useless or mean nothing. This is valuable. And on things like cyberspace, offensive cyber capabilities, space surveillance, space capabilities, intelligence, Five Eyes plus cooperation with, with South Korea and Japan. These are all important things. But our capacity to support the US in the Indo-Pacific is going to be somewhat narrowed in the next 5 years by the events we are seeing in the resurgence of the Russia challenge. So ultimately, I think that it's you talk to kind of Australians and Japanese and Indians. It's not that they think the European contribution is useless, but I think they and we realize it's going to be heavily constrained by what's happening in Ukraine.
We have a question that just came in from Mr. Philip Ha. How do we convince Ukraine and Taiwan of the need to optimize and pare back expectations? Ukraine is so far unwilling to give up taking back Luhansk or Donetsk, and Taiwan is still mainly prepared for an offensive invasion of the mainland than a defense of the island. Can we, or are we in a position to influence either Taipei or Kyiv on their sort of expectations? And if we can, what should we try to do?
Well, this is a long-standing debate in Taiwan, of course, where the U.S. for many years has tried to encourage what was called the alternative defense strategy, whose name is eluding me right now, but effectively a more sort of asymmetric approach, relying less on buying F-16s and tanks and more on buying, more land, more sea mines, autonomous vehicles, anti-ship cruise missiles, and asymmetric capabilities capable of denying a Chinese invasion, rather than capabilities that are useful in peacetime for things like escorting Chinese aircraft, but that would be taken out in the early stages of a conflict in a conventional campaign. That process is still occurring. I think I see some signs of optimism. Taiwan is moving more in that direction, particularly under the Tsai Ing-wen administration. But that's a kind of question about how you prepare for Ukraine's defense. It's a question of military strategy. And I think that US-Taiwan military cooperation has been intensifying under the Trump administration and under this administration in really interesting and important ways that have enabled that to be moving usefully. Ukraine's a different question. That's a political military question over, how much land do they give up in pursuit of a peace settlement? That all depends on what happens on the battlefield, and nobody knows what's going to happen on the battlefield. If Ukraine's counteroffensive runs out of steam, if your political trends at your midterm elections suggest a sort of populist political movements are gaining steam in ways that might undercut support for Ukraine in the long term, that will influence Ukrainian calculations. If it looks as though European publics are getting angry at the effect of the war on the cost of living and energy prices and are not willing to provide consent for support to Ukraine, that will influence battlefield dynamics. This is all very open. I don't think anyone wants to tell Ukraine to manage expectations yet. I think we want to see how they do on the battlefield. Even President Macron, who is kind of, obviously emphasizing the importance of negotiations for many months, has moved in a more hawkish, robust direction in the last few weeks, particularly since his visit to Kiev. So I think that at some point, yes, everyone realizes perhaps you will need to tell Kiev, look, we've got a compromise, but now is absolutely not that moment. I actually see a kind of hardening of the international consensus around the G7 summit last month, the NATO summit last month, a willingness to really intensify support to Ukraine. That mood could change as we get through the autumn and we approach the winter, I think.
Another question that's come in, which builds off of your answer to the previous question about sort of Taiwan's defense capabilities, and how has the hardening of views on China in Taipei impacted those capabilities and planning, and how do you see lessons from Ukraine carrying over? You mentioned sort of the shift in defense acquisitions sort of slowly happening. What do you envision over the next sort of 6, 12, 18 months as it relates to Taiwan?
I have to be very honest here and say that for the last 3 months, I've been so laser focused on Ukraine. I've had very little opportunity to do proper reporting on other things. And the last time I was in Taiwan was 3 years ago. So obviously I'm pretty out of date in that sense. But obviously they've had a lot of debates over conscription. When I was there, certainly there was real concern that conscription was a joke, that recruits were not getting adequate training, that there hadn't been adequate consideration of serious resistance operations and resistance movements. What some of the lessons we're seeing coming out of southern Ukraine and Kherson province on stay behind network, special forces activity, partisan activity has been that this can be remarkably successful if you prepare, if you lay the groundwork for this. By the way, some of this training was done by US special forces and other special forces, particularly around Kharkiv in the east of the country as well, which was done very covertly, done very secretly, but it did help prepare the Ukrainians for some of this. I would say you look at things like Hostomel Airport, the first day of the war, right? Bill Burns goes to Ukraine with all this intelligence about Russian war plans, tells the Ukrainians they're going to land at Hostomel Airport. Lo and behold, they're able to assist in take out this invading airborne force. The lesson is intelligence is hugely important. And so, having insight into Chinese planning and Chinese war plans is going to be absolutely fundamental to preparing for a defense of Taiwan. Some of the other lessons, I suspect it goes back to the points I was making, which is to say that whether or not some of these capabilities are going to be useful depends not on the capability, but on the back end of the capability. So for example, Taiwan has a lot of fantastic anti-ship cruise missiles already. They can be stuck into the back of a van, move around mountains and fire out. But what will be the what kind of targeting capability do you have? What level of granular detail will you have on coastal radar? Will you still have your coastal radar up and running? Will it be jammed? What is the software that will process this? Will it be on the edge of the platform, or will it be centrally processed and go out to units assisted by AI? What level of assistance will you have from US and allied space capability funneling new intelligence? These are the lessons we need to be pulling out of Ukraine, I think, and these will help countries like Taiwan prepare for their defense.
I want to zoom out to sort of like a 50,000-foot view, because we've covered the nuclear taboo, defense politics in the United Kingdom. What are the trends that you're most interested in keeping an eye on, sort of broadly, but then also what's the trend that you are most concerned about that's not getting the level of attention that it should when it comes to the changing character of war and defense?
Well, first of all, there are some big regional problems that we've had our eye off the ball. Iran is a big one because the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, is on the edge of collapse, and you know, I saw Rob Malley, the head of the US sort of Iran team, make renewed promise that military options would be on the table if Iran dashed for a bomb. But the US now faces an extraordinary situation where it has a huge land war in Europe, to which it is providing massive amounts of aid, and where it has been moving military assets to Europe's Eastern Front, a potential crisis in the Middle East with Iran, ongoing counterterrorism commitments, and a potential crisis over the horizon with Taiwan. And on top of that, North Korea, the North Korean nuclear program expanding and liable to conduct another nuclear test or another ICBM test. I cannot recall any period in my lifetime where the United States has had so many simultaneous, concurrent, profound, and difficult challenges, including on its armed forces. And all of this in a military where, you know, your budget is large, but it's flatlining, and you don't have the capability to take on these challenges at once. So, you know, this to me worries me the most at that macro level. In terms of the future of warfare, I would still say that a lot of the capabilities that we have thought about in the last few years have not been tested in this conflict. And we should, you know, we need to remember that. Space capabilities, counter space capabilities, kinetic or non-kinetic, jamming of satellites, microwave attacks on satellites, co-orbital weapons, laser dazzling of satellites on the ground, all of these things. How would they play out? We have weapon systems that are dependent on these space networks, and Ukraine has not told us an awful lot about this, although we did see a Russian cyber intrusion into Viasat, a satellite company that was providing services to Ukraine in the first day of this campaign. Undersea capabilities, particularly Russian undersea capabilities. They have something called GUGI, which is a kind of a deep sea naval capabilities. I think it's an arm of the GRU, the Military Intelligence Service, rather than an arm of the Navy, that does things like cable tapping, cable cutting. You know, these things, it would be very important in a NATO-Russia conflict. And they have not been substantially tested. Undersea capabilities are still, you know, really, really important to NATO, to the US, to others. And they were vitally important in the Indo-Pacific, which is why AUKUS is so you know, fundamentally important. So those haven't been tested. And the final point I would say is the jury is still out on cyber. Cyber is not a kind of magic wand, as some people might have thought it was, shutting down power grids, shutting down cities, shutting down military forces. But it is still a potentially hugely important supplement to conventional military capabilities. And I think this is why, if we talked about AUKUS earlier, Joshua, alongside the core submarine work being done in AUKUS for a next generation nuclear-powered submarine for Australia, are several other areas. What are they? Other emerging undersea capabilities, things like, you know, sort of undersea sensors, UAVs, cyber capabilities, electronic warfare, and cyber capabilities. NATO is working on these. AUKUS is working on these. The Quad is thinking about these. You know, I think these are still really vital capabilities that the Ukraine war is not necessarily, you know, the case that is the one that will explain how effective these are.
I'd be remiss if I didn't put a plug in for our national security space program here at the center, which is looking very much at the intersection of commercial space and national security space. So then Dan is heading up our geotech program, which is looking at the competition between the United States and China and liberal democracies and authoritarian capitalism. I can't thank you enough for what has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. We're coming up on the end of it. This has been wonderful. I could easily probably go on for another hour and then some, and I would be happy to provide either the coffee or the tea and the biscuits. But thank you so much. I'm going to flip it over to Dan for some closing remarks and wrapping it up.
Well, no, Joshua, I can't do more to add to our thanks and gratitude for an excellent conversation. Thought-provoking, certainly for those of us in Washington, considering the challenges we face, the need to mobilize in some ways, how we have to marshal resources to think smarter, not richer, and facing adversaries too who will match us in innovation and ability, things that we can no longer take for granted on the battlefield that are revealed to us. So again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to everyone. Please do stay in touch with us. We could continue this conversation long and day, but thank you for your time now, and take care, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me, both of you. I really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation.